Hey there, partner. Long day? Don't worry. You've come to the right place. Tonight, you're not just falling asleep. You're riding into the past. Close your eyes and feel the dust of the old trails settle. The fire's crackling low, your horse is fed, and the stars are hanging quiet above the open range. You're a cowboy now. Outlaws, wide skies, and lonely roads. They're all part of your story. So take a deep breath. Let the saddle aches fade away. This tale ain't about speed or shootouts. It's about peace, rest, and the gentle rhythm of the West. Before you drift off, drop a comment. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how far the trail reaches. Now lean back, partner. Let the quiet take over. We're about to ride into dreamland together. Close your eyes and imagine this. 40 miles of dust behind you, your stomach hollow, your throat lined with grit. You stagger into a saloon hoping for comfort. Before we step inside, take a slow breath, dim the lights if you like, and let yourself settle into the quiet. What you get is stew, a thick, questionable mixture bubbling on the fire. Maybe beef, maybe something else you probably shouldn't ask about. But it is hot, and it is edible, and that's enough. And as you push deeper into the saloon, the air waiting for you tells its own story. The saloon doors creak open, and the first thing that greets you isn't comfort. It's an overwhelming wall of smell. For a half second, the faint trace of wood smoke teases you with the thought of an actual meal. Then it's gone, buried under sharper scents. Whiskey fumes hang like vapor, mixed with the sweat of men who haven't seen water in weeks, the bitter tang of crushed tobacco, and the musk of dust shaken loose from boots that seem older than the men wearing them. Some places tried to scatter sawdust across the floor, as though that light scatter of pine could camouflage the stench. It never really worked. You swallow hard against the taste that sits heavy in the back of your throat before your eyes even have a chance to adjust to the glow inside. This isn't the warm gathering hall you might have dreamed about out on the trail. It's a small, crowded room where endurance is pressed into service as hospitality. The light inside fights itself. Lamps warm a few corners, leaving the rest in gloom where men slump over their cards. The air itself feels layered. At the top hangs smoke, staining rafters and fabric. Beneath it, the salt and iron of sweat and dust-soaked clothes. Somewhere far in the background, a pot gives off the thin promise of meat, edged with that sour boil of fat that's been reheated one too many times. Your hunger pushes you forward, but the closer you breathe, the more your mind begins to doubt what your stomach insists on. Beneath you, the floor groans under each step as though it's been carrying the weight of tired bodies for decades. Sawdust softens little of the noise, crunching underfoot. Grease has seeped into every board, weaving black streaks into the grain. A card slaps onto a table, sending up a faint puff of dust, followed by tired laughter that peaks, then dies. Coins clink, mugs touch together without ceremony. The sounds aren't cheerful. They're functional, marks of lives running on habit more than joy. The saloon tries to pose as a place of pause, but the longer you stand, the clearer it is. All it offers is postponement, never real relief. You may have imagined this room would hand you a plate of beef, maybe bread softer than the leather in your saddlebag. Instead, The closest thing to luxury is something fried in bacon grease, so thin it barely coats the bottom of the pan. The food doesn't promise satisfaction. It promises only enough to hold you on your feet. What's offered isn't dinner. It's trial by endurance. Your stomach calls out for something hot, but your nose whispers the truth. This menu was built to keep men alive, not to please them. The longer you look, the more details reveal themselves. Most bottles lining the shelves hold whiskey that's been thinned with too much water. No one dares complain. The cook's entire kingdom rests in one corner, a dented iron pot suspended above embers fighting their way through damp logs, a pan scraped thin with use, and the smell of meals gone stale years ago clinging to the metal. Around the room, familiar patterns loop endlessly. Boots drag, chairs scrape, insults drift, coughing echoes. The rhythm isn't designed for feasts. It belongs to survival. And yet, in the sameness of it, there's a strange calm. You realize that every dusty traveler before you stepped into this same haze of sweat, smoke, and boiled fat. They, too, weighed the choice. Sit down and eat what's here, or turn back to the trail with hunger riding your back. That silent, shared acceptance is the first lesson the saloon offers. Cowboy life is not built on plenty, or even choice. It's founded on making do with scarcity and taking whatever brief pause the world hands you. Still, philosophy doesn't fill a stomach. Hunger eventually convinces you to step deeper inside. The deeper you see, the sharper the reminders. A half-eaten hunk of bread sags beside a coffee cup, forgotten in favor of cards. At another table, brown stew sloshes around greasy circles floating on its surface. You let yourself pretend that maybe your bowl will be better, but a look at the stringy meat inside others tells you otherwise. The truth sits heavy. The food isn't here to impress. It's here to keep you from falling over before tomorrow. A glance at the men eating confirms it. No one looks pleased. They don't linger. They don't savor. They swallow mechanically, barely glancing up from cards or shadows. A man tears a strip of salt pork, eyes dull. Another stirs cold beans with little interest, chewing as if on autopilot. Each face says the same thing. Food isn't a memory here. It's fuel, plain and immediate. Even the furniture echoes the same message. Tables are scarred and greasy, bearing knife cuts and cigarette burns too deep to rub away. Chairs wobble but hold, patched and repatched. Lamplight reveals nothing flattering, throwing heavy shadows across blackened boards. In that dim glow, everything looks more questionable, yet hunger dulls the hesitation enough to keep spoons moving. The soundscape works like another reminder. Dice scatter against wood, spoons scrape against crockery, voices murmur under it all. None of it comforts, but none of it stops either. These are the quiet mechanics of survival. You give your coin, the saloon gives you enough food to last the trail another day. That is the exchange. No extra frills, no promise of delight. The choice itself carries no excitement, only chance. Men don't waive menus here. The day decides what you'll eat. Maybe beans, maybe stew, maybe bread gone hard. Either way, no one argues when the cook ladles it out. You take what's given, because by walking through those doors, you agreed to the rule. A saloon didn't care if you enjoyed dinner. It cared that you ingested something that might let you stand tomorrow. And yet, within all the bowls sliding across tables, one dish shows up over and over. Brown, unadorned, thick, plain. It doesn't pretend to be more, and maybe that's why it feels so honest. For most cowboys sitting in that half-light, this humble dish wasn't just regular, it was essential. Without it, they wouldn't ride out the next day. Tonight, as you watch spoonfuls vanish into tired faces, the lesson grows clear. Sometimes survival didn't wear the face of feast. Sometimes it wore the face of beans. After the long hours in the saloon haze, your eyes finally turn to the plate in front of you. What sits steaming in the bowl is the most ordinary dish the frontier knew. Beans. Pinto, black or navy, whatever the supply wagons had hauled through the dust. This was the dish that always appeared when cowboys sat down hungry at a rough-hewn table. They were never chosen out of love. They were chosen because they were the only ingredient that never failed. After gnawing 5 days' worth of trail rations, hardtack that splintered your teeth, jerky so dry it turned to leather on your tongue, beans might not seem like much, but they gave something the trail never did: warmth and bulk. They filled your belly when nothing else could, and even if they weren't exciting, they carried the one quality life out here demanded most: dependability. Saloon cooks relied on beans because they were cheap, simple to store, and almost indestructible. Dried beans could sit in sacks for months without spoiling, ride in bulk across wagon tracks, and wait in the pantry until the pot called for them. No anxious calculation about deliveries, no risk of the meat spoiled before arrival. A few heaping scoops into boiling water, hours of softening, and bowls could be filled again and again. Every tavern and saloon from Texas to Montana leaned on beans like a crutch. They were the easiest way to guarantee you would always have something to feed the men who staggered through the door. But nobody mistook them for a delicacy. On a good day, they were bland and serviceable. On a bad day, they were punishment. Sometimes they cooked too quickly, gritty, half-raw skins that made chewing more labor than eating. Other times, left too long, they collapsed into a paste heavy enough to coat your mouth for hours. They could scorch too, blackening at the bottom of the pot when the fire ran too hot, a flavor that clung to the entire stew like a bitter reminder of the cook's distraction. Flavor was never the goal. Survival was. At most, seasoning arrived in the form of salt, or the faint smokiness of whatever kind of wood happened to burn under the kettle. Even so, when you sat down in a saloon and stared at a steaming heap of beans, relief came with the first spoonful. They were filling. They gave you the calories to last another day. For a traveler who hadn't tasted anything green in weeks, they were as close to vegetables as you'd get. Every stubborn cowboy who groaned about yet another bowl still scraped their plate clean. The monotony built a kind of ritual. The work outside was backbreaking, the nights were long, but the beans waited faithfully each evening, unchanged. Cooking them required patience, more than skill. Hours of soaking and simmering went into each pot, turning rock-hard seeds into something that resembled dinner. You can imagine the cook ladling them out, shift after shift, knowing exactly how little variety his kitchen offered. Add a few cubes of salt pork and the pot became luxury. Pork fat softened in the heat, releasing streaks of oil that floated across the surface. The small morsels of meat were chased down by every spoon, little prizes hidden in a swamp of starch. Nobody called it a feast, but every man knew those glistening scraps would be the best bites on the table. When a cook had ambition, or the supplies allowed, something new was slipped into the pot. a scrap of onion if a cart happened by, a pinch of dried chili powder on the rarest days. But such flourishes were exceptions. Most nights, beans came undisturbed. Water, salt, and fat, if fortune was kind. To a man who grew up on softer bread and seasoned roasts back east, this could feel unbearable. But out on the range, what mattered was not taste, but staying upright through another day of labor. In that sameness, beans leveled the room. Rich gambler or penniless hand, everyone bent over the same bowl. The saloon didn't care about pride. If you were seated at the table, you faced beans like everyone else. That silence across the room, the scrape of spoons, the mechanical chewing, the tired sighs, reminded you this wasn't food for pleasure. It was food that erased differences. You ate, you filled up, and you carried on. Over time, the repetition wore men down, yet it also built an identity. Eating beans every night was proof of endurance. They gave energy to push cattle another mile, to sit another hour at a poker table, to brace against another punishing ride. When you shoveled beans into your stomach, you didn't cheer, you didn't celebrate, but you reminded yourself you could keep going. That act of enduring sameness became its own kind of strength, and in a strange way, beans became a mirror for the frontier itself, uneventful, repetitive, never admired, but always steady. They always showed up, even when everything else failed, when meat spoiled in the sun, when shipments ran late, when crops turned against you. There was still a burlap sack of beans waiting in the back. Travelers told stories, some half-believed, about their importance. There are tales, likely exaggerated, of men bartering with beans, even swapping a horse for a salted sack and a promise to disappear. True or not, such rumors only underline how essential beans were considered. In a world measured by scarcity, sacks of beans represented certainty. There was, of course, the aftermath. A full saloon, every man's belly packed with beans, made the air not unbearable but memorable. That lingering effect was as much a joke as a reality, and in crowded quarters, it was a challenge everyone politely ignored until the lamps were dimmed and the room spread thinner. Beans worked twice, once at the table, then again hours later. And so, beans were not a dish cowboys boasted about, but they were the steady heartbeat of the kitchen. Dependable, filling, and indifferent to taste, they fueled every ride, every brawl, every hand of cards. A cowboy's gratitude wasn't enthusiastic, but it was sincere. In a begrudging, practical way, men thanked beans for showing up when nothing else could. That leaves the next question. If beans carried the load as the dependable staple, what sat beside them to round out the meal? After all, starch alone was never enough. There needed to be something heavier, greasier, rougher on the tongue, an ingredient that could either comfort or punish, depending on how it was cooked. And that role belonged to one slab of meat, salted until it could outlast the desert air. Imagine the slab of meat that turned up in nearly every saloon kitchen, not because anyone loved it, but because it refused to go away. Salt pork, the greasy backbone of frontier food. It wasn't bacon. It wasn't ham. It was pork belly packed in barrels, preserved through heavy salting and sometimes smoking, sealed away so it could survive months in storage, wagon rides over broken plains, or a journey rolled at the bottom of a saddlebag. That preservation made it reliable when nothing else lasted. It wasn't delicious, but it was constant. and constancy was its only promise. On your plate, salt pork could be punishment or sustenance, sometimes both at once. Tough enough to resist your teeth, salty enough to sting your tongue, greasy enough to coat your hands for hours. It was never subtle. Some who ate it claimed it was like chewing leather dipped in brine, while others swore their worst pieces resembled a salted boot heel, a phrase muttered often enough around tables to stick in memory. The words weren't compliments, but they weren't exaggerations either. Frontier pork earned its reputation one chewy bite at a time. Still, when you were hungry, complaints faded into pragmatism. Salt pork was heavy with calories. Grease clung to your ribs, settling deep, carrying you through another ride on the trail. After 10 hours roping cattle under hard sun, or shivering through dusk as the dust rattled in your teeth, flavor wasn't the point. Salt pork delivered fuel. It was brute food for brute work, stripped of nostalgia or pleasure. Convenience didn't matter in a world without refrigeration. Endurance did. Saloons leaned hard on that endurance. Fresh beef spoiled in a day if heat pressed down too strong. Chickens were delicate, incapable of surviving travel. Vegetables wilted, bread turned stale. Yet salt pork endured both travel and time. A slab might arrive with a supply wagon, dunked in salt, dried stiff, and pulled into the kitchen like treasure. And treasure it was, at least to the cook whose job depended on stretching tough cuts over weeks of paying mouths. Wherever you traveled in the West, a familiar scent drifted up from the rafters, pork frying, or boiling, or simply sweating in a pan, waiting to be divided. Cooks squeezed everything they could from it. Thick strips went into skillets until the edges curled crisp, fat dripping into the pan in slick puddles. That fat wasn't discarded. It became cooking oil, frying biscuits, potatoes, even stubborn beans, until they carried a faint echo of pork. It seasoned crusts that would have been lifeless without grease. At times the scraps went into stew pots, sharp with brine, giving watery broth a stronger backbone. Nobody wasted rind either. It was simmered into soup or chewed when nothing better could be found. Even the last drippings were scraped from pans to slick the next loaf or ladled onto whatever looked driest on the table. Nothing was tossed aside unless a dog was lucky enough to catch what humans couldn't swallow. The trouble was consistency. Properly cooked, salt pork resembled something close to bacon. Salty, chewy enough, with flavor riding on the edge of indulgence. Poorly cooked, it was less forgiving. Cowboys reported it stringy, stiff, and sometimes acrid enough to leave bitterness lingering for hours. Complaints weren't whispered. They were spoken around tables with the same tone men used to curse the trail. Yet those same men had no choice but to chew every strip. You didn't waste food in the West. To spit aside what could still be swallowed was to risk hunger later, and hunger kept fewer friends than bad pork did. Planning menus around it wasn't a matter of taste, but necessity. Beans without pork were weak starch. Stew without pork was thin water. Biscuits without drippings were flavorless lumps. That one salted slab, divided carefully by a cook's knife, determined if a saloon meal had any weight at all. Supply chains were slow, fragile, and distant. A barrel rolled in could sustain a kitchen for weeks, portion by portion, stringing together enough meals to keep paying men fed long enough to shuffle out the door. Pork kept tables busy, and busy tables kept saloons afloat. Without it, too many kitchens would have gone quiet overnight. And yet, for all its necessity, Salt pork was rarely loved. Cowboys chased it with whiskey or coffee, ways to blunt the salt scraping their tongues. Extra bread sometimes softened the blow, spreading sharpness across bland rations. Nobody sang praise of the meat. Nobody retold stories of salt pork as fond memory at a fire. They spoke of the cattle drive, or the struggle through storms, or the brawl in town, but never of pork. Salt pork was fuel with no romance attached, eaten because refusing it wasn't an option. Sitting at a saloon table, you might see it lying across beans in the bowl, or fried into curling strips served atop biscuits, or diced into the day's stew. A lucky slice made one man nod slightly in contentment, while the unlucky gnawed their way through stiff edges quietly, swallowing hard. The room didn't fill with joy. It filled with endurance. The pork wasn't shared celebration. It was shared survival, enough to keep heads bent down until plates emptied. Everywhere in the kitchen, salt pork made its mark. It flavored beans day after day, drifted into stews night after night, seasoned biscuits with grease that lingered on lips. Even the coffee sometimes carried a faint echo of it, poured after pans were cleaned with grease still clinging to iron. It settled into the very timbers of saloons, grease drifting upward with smoke, layering walls with years of oily permanence. Even if no pork sat on your plate, its taste haunted whatever else you ate. Dependence bred contradiction. Men cursed its taste, mocked its toughness, grumbled around tables. But when salt pork went missing, unease grew louder still. No pork meant weak meals, beans too thin, biscuits too dry, stew too bordering on water. Its absence made hunger keen. Its presence made boredom heavy. And so men were caught in between, unwilling to cheer for it, too reliant to live without it. Salt pork wasn't loved, but it was needed. That need extended beyond the saloon table. Cowboys carried strips when they lacked fire. Tough, salty bites gnawed on horseback, brought enough strength to continue past one more ridge. Others tucked scraps into saddle rolls to chew later, the meat still stiff but steady. Taken this way, salt pork shed even the pretense of being a meal. It was insurance, proof that no matter how long the gap stretched until town, food existed in some form. The common truth across the frontier was simple. Every saloon counted on salt pork. Grease spattering from pans was a sign meals would continue one more night. Even when plates brought little pleasure, there was comfort in the rhythm of its survival. Salt pork made food possible, whether or not it made food good. Cowboys leaned on it, cooks depended on it, and saloon keepers staked their tables on slabs that could last past every storm, brawl, or week gone lean. So night after night, tables filled with the same contradiction, loud complaints swallowed with quiet obedience. Salt pork wasn't a symbol of celebration. It was the grit of survival salted into meat, a reminder that heat, grease, and persistence outlived taste or preference. Men bent over it every evening, not because they wanted to, but because it gave them no choice. But even the saloon recognized that monotony had limits. A steady slab could stretch only so far, and cooks needed another way to pad out their tables, another dish to extend scraps, disguise flavors, and feed every hungry man in the room, which led to the pot simmering at the edge of any stove, the catch-all solution served straight, transformed into something thick, steaming, and suspiciously filling. Stew was the dish that anchored nearly every saloon table, the one thing you could count on finding no matter where you rode. Known as the great equalizer of frontier cooking, it wasn't a carefully crafted recipe, but the most practical answer to hunger in a place where ingredients were never guaranteed. You didn't ask where the contents came from. You accepted a steaming bowl because it was hot, it was filling, and it gave you a reason to keep sitting upright after a day that had already drained you to the bone. The pot itself told its story long before you tasted it. Heavy iron, smudged black from years of fire, set just beyond the heat so it could bubble endlessly. Inside, a shifting brown broth gave off steam as if the pot was breathing. On a fortunate day, you might catch tender chunks of beef floating in the mix, thick enough to cling to your spoon. On leaner days, the meat might look less convincing. Squirrel, rabbit, maybe even rattlesnake, if the cook had been ambitious. Nobody spoke about it directly, because the unspoken rule was always the same. One glance was enough, but questions about what you were eating never helped the appetite. Vegetables, when they appeared, didn't fare well. Potatoes collapsed into shapeless mush. Carrots dissolved until their color disappeared. Onions softened until it left no trace but a hint of sweetness. What you were left with was a texture closer to paste than salad, the kind of bulk that existed solely to stretch meat further across the table. Flavor wasn't the point. Weight in your stomach was. As for seasoning, rare was the day a cook spared pepper or chili powder unless the saloon could afford such luxuries. A scatter of black pepper meant you'd found a respectable haul. A spoonful of chili powder meant your next breath might sting. For everyone else, flavor came from smoke drifting in through the fire or from the fat rendered by whatever scraps floated on top. The greatest mystery of stew was its unpredictability. Each mouthful carried the possibility of relief or regret. Rich broth soothing you one moment, stringy meat resisting your spoon the next. Cowboys eased the uncertainty with humor because it was easier to laugh than to worry about what was sliding across your tongue. One traveler even claimed he once found a bootstring floating in his serving, whether truth or exaggeration hardly mattered. Stories like that became part of stew's legend, retold because they made the whole ordeal tolerable. The pot's trick was its permanence. It was never washed, never fully emptied. When it ran low, water was added. When a cook found scraps, they were tossed in. The stew thickened and thinned in cycles, reheated day after day, sometimes lasting through a week or more. Each new boil pulled the old forward, so no one could tell where today's ingredients ended and yesterday's began. What landed on your spoon was less a recipe than a running history of everyone who had eaten there before you. At its best, the broth was hearty and warming. At its worst, it settled into a thick, familiar brown that comforted more by heat than by flavor. You never ate stew in silence or solitude. It demanded company. Rough tables packed men shoulder to shoulder in the dim saloon, mugs crowded beside each other while spoons clattered against bowls in uneven rhythm. No one cared who sat down next to them. Miner, gambler, ranch hand, outlaw. All leaned into the same pot just the same. That shared gamble gave stew its name as the equalizer. In a room divided by money, cards, or bad tempers, the stew brought everyone to the same level for as long as it took to finish a bowl. No two saloons had the same stew, but the ritual was always familiar. In a larger town, meat could come from a butcher and carry at least some tenderness. Vegetables might have a chance of keeping their shape, and onions might perfume the broth. In an outpost scraping by, the stew was thinner, the meat questionable, the filler barely disguising the fact that nothing fresh had passed through the kitchen in weeks. Regardless of the differences, the outcome for the diners was the same. Bowls filled, flavors endured, and nobody asked too many questions. For all its shortcomings, stew always delivered what mattered. After the first few spoonfuls, warmth spread through your hands and chest, a slow reassurance that hunger would be quieted for a few hours. The broth might have carried streaks of floating fat or a stringy bite you'd rather not discuss, but none of that mattered once your stomach started to settle. The fire used to heat it did double duty. It eased the chill that had sunk into your body all day, and it reminded you, however briefly, that you made it through another night. The element of chance became part of its character. Some nights, generous beef and real seasoning made for a meal that almost felt intentional. Other nights, thin broth passed as stew, more water than food, carrying only the faintest trace of meat at the bottom. Even then, lines still formed at the table. It wasn't about quality. It was about presence. Even a weak stew was still welcome because weak stew was better than the biting emptiness of hunger. Stew carried the tone of an agreement, quiet and unspoken. You trusted that pot not because you wanted to, but because you had to. It was less cuisine than contract, a guarantee that however grim the day had been, you would not end it unfed. That trust didn't rest on taste. It rested on repetition. Every saloon made it. Every cowboy ate it. No one remembered it fondly, but no one could forget the way it fueled them across one more day. Kitchens never disguised what stew was. They didn't pretend to artistry or fine dining. Every cook knew it was survival turned edible. The momentary peace it offered wasn't on the tongue, but in the pause, the scraping of spoons, the shallow hum of conversation slowing as men filled their bowls. That was as close as the saloon came to quiet, and for a few bites it felt almost safe. By the time your bowl sat empty, your body felt heavier, steadier, not satisfied, not delighted, but prepared enough to keep moving, which, in the harsh order of the frontier, was all the meal ever promised to do. And when the bowls were cleared and the steam from the pot began to fade, the saloon's table turned toward its last consolation. Because once the stew's warmth was gone, the night narrowed to a mug brewing in its place, a darker, sharper dose of comfort that waited in the bottom of a tin cup. When the stew's warmth finished, the night narrowed to coffee. The mug that followed stew carried something harsher than food, a liquid both dreaded and depended on: cowboy coffee. If the saloon had a kitchen, chances are this was being poured. It was never elegant and never subtle. Grounds were tossed straight into the kettle with water of uncertain origin, boiled until the brew turned so dark it seemed to stain the pot itself. No filter, no straining, no gentleness. Just a sharp, black drink that cowboys called both fuel and punishment. The method was as simple as it was unforgiving. Coarse grounds were shaken into cold water, the kettle set over flames, and then left to boil hard without concern for timing. When the liquid reached the right shade of black, thick, bitter, and full-bodied enough to make you blink, it was ladled straight into tin mugs, grounds and all. That meant every swallow carried grit, and the final mouthful was thick with soggy coffee leftovers. One cowboy jokingly swore it was a brew that dared you not to spit it back out. But spit was fuel wasted, and nobody could afford that. Taste was never the aim. Some mugs came across as sharp and acrid. Others coated the tongue in bitterness that stuck for hours. On the worst days, the liquid resembled syrup, more sludge than drink. The research describes it as smelling like burnt dreams and tasting like vengeance. But those were the words of men trying to joke their way through the grimace on their faces. The truth was plainer. Cowboy coffee tasted awful, but it delivered its purpose. It jolted you awake when nothing else could. Supplies shaped every mug. Sugar might soften the edge, but sugar was scarce. Canned milk, rare and dear, was tucked aside for those willing to pay. Most of the time, the coffee came black, bracing, and unrelenting. To make beans last, cooks often reused grounds, pouring fresh water over yesterday's remains. The first pot might kick you upright. The third tasted more like boiled regret, weak and hollow. But men drank it anyway. Even watery disappointment was better than trudging across the plains without it. Still, there was comfort in the ritual. You'd watch rough hands shake coffee into a soot-dark pot, hear the hiss as it boiled, and know things were running on schedule. Whether heard in a lonely shack on the trail or in a saloon filled with card games and the scrape of chairs, the sound of coffee boiling meant something predictable still existed. Cowboys leaned into that routine. The taste didn't matter, but the act, sitting, wrapping cold hands around a hot tin mug, became a steadying moment in lives with little room for certainty. Some saloons gained reputations for coffee so sharp it bordered on violent. Travelers wrote of it being old and strong enough to strip paint. If a kettle had been stoked all day and reheated more than once, by late afternoon its contents thickened into a tar-like bitterness that made men cough after the first sip. And yet that was expected. A weak cup was a failure. Coffee was supposed to bite back. The stronger it was, the more authentic it felt. Cowboys didn't ask for smoothness. They asked for proof that it would keep them awake through the night. No one drank with joy. Faces tightened as mugs rose, brows furrowed against the bitterness, and the occasional cough broke through the room. Men cursed the coffee, laughed at its cruelty, then asked for another pour. Whiskey dulled you with fire. Coffee punished you into staying awake. Cowboys lined up for both for the same reason: endurance. They didn't drink to enjoy, they drank to go on. And go on they did. This harsh brew pulled men through midnight cattle watches when the fire burned low and sleep tugged at their eyes. It revived them in mornings when saddles froze solid and their breath hung white in the air. One cowboy grumbled it felt like a kick from a mule, only to add that he missed it whenever it wasn't there. That summed up the paradox. No one liked cowboy coffee, but everyone needed it. It carried weight beyond the physical, too. Holding a mug was a signal. You were still moving. You still had the strength to keep working, riding, playing cards another hour. Around saloon tables, half-full cups sat forgotten until someone refilled them, the cycle repeating over and over. Complaining about the coffee was part of the performance. Finishing it, though, meant toughness. Leave grounds at the bottom, and you wasted fuel. Swallow them, grit and all, and you showed what the frontier demanded. Discomfort swallowed without flinching. Most men never knew coffee any other way. Black, boiling hot, often grainy, sometimes made with water that smelled faintly of the animals who drank from it first. Scarcity allowed no refinements. Yet when mugs were served, something shifted in posture, in voice. Exhaustion grew quieter. Hope flickered just enough to make the next mile possible. Cowboy coffee was punishment and promise wrapped together. Saloons leaned on its other purpose too. After late-night whiskey, coffee was the only cure on hand. It scoured dry throats, masked the heaviness of beans and stew lingering in the stomach, and allowed cowboys to crawl back onto their feet with at least the appearance of strength. Whiskey could be watered down by a dishonest bar. Beans could be stretched into thin gruel. Stew could hide scraps barely fit for a plate. But the coffee never lied. If it was foul and bitter, it was genuine. That foulness was, perversely, a guarantee. The final swallow was its own challenge, grounds resting heavy at the bottom, thick as muddy sludge after a storm. Yet it disappeared all the same. Waste was unthinkable. Those gritty mouthfuls forced men to accept what cowboy life required, swallowing what you disliked just to keep going. And that was the lesson carried in every mug, that endurance mattered more than comfort. Cowboy coffee mirrored everything else cowboys ate. Beans filled the belly but dulled the spirit. Salt pork lasted forever, but coated everything in grease. Stew fed the crowd, but left men guessing what they'd actually swallowed. Whiskey buried fatigue. But coffee kept you awake when nothing else would. It wasn't graceful, and it wasn't kind, but it did what mattered. You wrapped your hands around the tin, swallowed through the bitterness, and felt a spark return. That small, punishing spark was a lifeline. The brew may have tasted like soot or tar, and it may have left grit between your teeth. But every man learned the same truth. You didn't drink it for pleasure. You drank it because survival had no other flavor. Endurance poured out black and bitter, and every swallow was a reminder that life on the frontier was meant to be lived, not savored. And when the mugs finally set back down, the saloon kitchen's rare treasures came to mind. Harsh drinks were routine, but there were dishes so unusual, so fragile, they hinted at something better. Fragile proof that the wild could, at times, taste almost like home. That was where true luxury began. What frontier dish could actually make a cowboy pause and feel something close to comfort? Not beans, not pork, and not even stew. It was eggs. A plate with eggs on it, scrambled into a pale mound, or fried with the yolk still glistening, could draw a sigh from a man who'd spent weeks chewing dried rations. They were rare because chickens themselves were scarce, often stolen, left to wander, or carried off by foxes. And even when eggs were collected, their shells cracked easily during rough transport. If a saloon managed to serve eggs at all, it meant someone had kept chickens alive nearby, or smuggled the fragile shells across the trail without losing them. That effort gave eggs an almost ceremonial value. The gamble started the moment the plate landed in front of you. Sometimes the eggs were smoky from pans that hadn't seen soap. Other times they arrived thin and fried until the yolks tightened into rubber. A few cooks scrambled aging eggs just to disguise their color, mixing them with oil until the smell was harder to notice. Ordering eggs wasn't simple indulgence. It was a calculated risk. Cowboys quietly accepted that rolling the dice might bring leathery protein one day or stomach trouble the next. They accepted the risk of a bad egg because the comfort of a fresh breakfast mattered more. When they were decent, even just halfway tender, the effect stretched past the tongue. Scraping a fork through soft egg, hearing the hiss from the pan as somebody else's serving sizzled in the back, it pulled men back toward memory. Home kitchens, the idea of routine, mornings with sunlight through shutters instead of dust through cracks in a cabin wall, momentary illusions, but powerful ones. Food rarely brought nostalgia on the trail, so when eggs did, the saloon became uncharacteristically quiet. For a few minutes, conversation slowed. Coffee and beans waited untouched as men eased forks into fragile piles of egg, trying to savor something that felt personal in a world built on survival. Of course, not every plate carried comfort. Old eggs spoiled quickly, and one ruined serving could clear a table in disgust. The smell of sulfur drifting above the pan spread fast in the room. A man unlucky enough to draw that plate might shove it aside, reach for whiskey instead, and let the others choke down their share. But even after bad experiences, the order was usually placed again the next time eggs appeared. The fantasy of a warm breakfast proved heavier than reason. Chickens themselves showed up even less often, placed on menus the way merchants display goods they barely have. They weren't the plump birds you might picture from farmyards back east. Frontier chickens were lean, tough from scratching in barren dust, more bone than flesh. When the cook chose to fry one, the bird was dropped into lard until what little meat there was tightened along the frame. The result came out chewy and dry, but undeniably hot. And in a land of beans, even stringy chicken was accepted as a triumph. Holding a piece of fried chicken had its own weight, different from the anonymous slop of stew. It was something you could grip, bite into, and wrestle with. The meat didn't glide. It resisted. You had to tear at it, chew longer, wipe grease down your wrist. That tactile resistance was its charm. It wasn't the substance of chickens back east, but it broke routine. A cowboy sitting with a rough cut of chicken felt, for a moment, like he was eating a full meal rather than fuel in disguise. Poultry marked saloons apart from each other. Every table on the frontier could be filled with beans, salt pork, or pot stew. But if you wandered into a room with eggs steaming on the plate or fried chicken stacked for breakfast, you knew it meant something. The saloon had better reach, stronger supply, or just more daring ambition. Men remembered those meals long after cards were lost or coin was spent. They spoke of fried chicken the way others spoke of distant towns, as places worth passing through again. Gossip carried stories of yellow yolks or the miracle of half-moist poultry, as if those rare meals proved civilization might still exist nearby. That impression carried weight back onto the trail. Ask a cowboy weeks later what he remembered of a saloon meal, and he wouldn't describe the stew. He wouldn't talk about salt pork, but he might repeat, half smiling, the morning he ate eggs that actually ran soft across the plate, or the night he gnawed chicken until grease settled heavy in his chest. The quality didn't matter. The memory did. It broke through the monotony like a light through smoke, reminding men they still lived inside a human rhythm, not just survival. Even when poultry disappointed, morale still bent upward. Cowboys knew the eggs might be leathery or chicken stringy, but seeing those foods at all proved some effort was made. The frontier taught that intention mattered more than outcome. Eggs cracked into pans and birds fried in lard told men the saloon had worked to stretch past bare necessity. That signal was enough to lift spirits. The trail pressed men into sameness. Eggs and chicken split the cycle, if only for a meal. And of course, each serving carried fragility. Eggs vanished as quickly as they arrived, cracked shells lost in handling. Chickens didn't multiply overnight and had to be guarded against absence. That scarcity always followed the memory. You might not see eggs again for months, might not chew on poultry again until another lucky arrival. Their rarity cemented their role as luxuries, foods that carried morale across days, heavy with bean stew and bitter coffee. So yes, most eggs lean toward tough, and most chicken lean toward dry, but both delivered more than their taste. They served as reminders that food could still bring relief, however brief. Even imperfect, eggs could hush a saloon, and chicken could trick the hand into thinking it was holding real abundance. That ability to lift mood and break repetition gave eggs and chicken their value, far more than their nourishment. In the memory of cowboys, they became the small luxuries worth gossiping about, worth remembering on quiet nights out under the stars. When the meal ended, shells cracked and bones stacked in corners. The return to beans and pork was inevitable. But that didn't erase the momentary shift. It only made it more vivid in hindsight. For all their imperfection, fragile poultry meals gave shape to a different kind of frontier memory, the kind balanced between scarcity and yearning for something more. Yet eggs and chicken, however rare, shared one weakness. They spoiled fast. They demanded luck, constant tending, and protection from the elements. They couldn't serve every man, every day. To carry meals across weeks without ruining, kitchens needed foods less fragile, something designed to last inside barrels, pressed into wheels, or sealed away in jars. Those foods didn't impress with richness, but they endured, and that endurance made them just as vital as any fleeting luxury. What food could survive weeks in a barrel or jar without rotting, but still appear on a saloon table as if it belonged there? Cheese and pickled goods. These were the quiet anchors of a cowboy's menu, the foods that waited in the background while the beans, pork, and stew stole the spotlight. They weren't glamorous, and they didn't try to be. They stayed edible long after other foods had gone sour, molding, or crawling with insects. When your choices were scarce, hard cheese and vinegar-soaked sides felt less like treats and more like lifelines. You didn't ask for them on account of taste. You asked for them because they showed up when nothing else could. Picture a chunk of saloon cheese on a wooden board. Hard, brittle, salty, maybe crumbly at the edges. It might taste sharp, biting at the tongue, or it might taste dull, as though the flavor had given up weeks ago. Some slices held, some leaned sour, some even developed personalities that were hard to ignore. You never really knew what you'd face until your teeth sank in. A well-kept wedge was comforting. It chewed cleanly, gave you fat and salt, and settled in your stomach like a promise. A poorly kept piece, well, you chewed it anyway. On the frontier, edible was often the most daring compliment a meal could get, and it wasn't just chance whether the cheese was good or not. No refrigeration meant every block aged wherever it was stored. In damp saloons, in trail wagons bumping across dry flats, or in kitchens where smoke clung to every surface. Every bite was a gamble between tasty and suspicious. The upside, though, was that cheese traveled far better than fresh meat or bread. Beef would rot. Poultry spoiled quick. Baked bread lasted a few days before hardening into stone. A hunk of salted hard cheese? That lasted weeks, even months, cracked off bit by bit like salvage from an edible brick. Cheese also meant there was a cow nearby, living or freshly milked. That wasn't a guarantee in mining outposts or desert settlements. If a saloon served cheese, it hinted at some connection. Maybe a farm down the road, maybe a settler willing to part with her milk trade, maybe someone who'd smuggled around over hills in a cart. Either way, seeing cheese on your plate meant you were sitting in a saloon that had at least a thread of connection to something resembling stability. That gave it weight beyond taste. It meant someone had thought ahead, preserved, and offered you food that extended beyond emergency rations. But cheese came in forms, and none were soft, melty, or fresh the way you might dream. This was frontier cheese, dense, cured, and salty to last. Some cubes were so tough they had to be shaved thin with a blade. Others broke apart in chalky crumbs, scattering across a plate and clinging to your hands. No matter the variety, cheese always required effort to eat. And that effort was the cost you paid for reliability. Because while you gnawed on the stubborn block, you knew one thing above all: it wouldn't kill you tonight. Pickled goods told the same story. Behind every bar, behind every saloon counter, jars lined the shelves like silent sentries. Some carried cucumbers, swollen and pale from weeks of vinegar. Others trapped eggs, cloudy whites floating in brine like strange monuments to survival. Onions, peaches, pears. Almost anything could be pickled. Vinegar and salt were the nearest thing to refrigeration available, and they turned fragile produce into long-lasting morsels that could stare at cowboys from shelves without spoiling for months. The jars themselves looked half medical, half culinary. Glass fogged with sour liquid, lumps of food drifting in and out of sight. Not appetizing, but dependable. Pulling a pickle from a jar often meant you were too hungry or too cautious to risk the meat pot. Stew looked questionable. Beans ran out. Pork slime unappetizing. Then you leaned toward the vinegar jars. A cucumber might crunch sharp, bringing sourness that split through monotony, or it might sag soggy, collapsing between the teeth without much resistance. Either way, you got salt, minerals, and that faint satisfaction of eating something fresh adjacent on a plate dominated by grease. The sour shock wasn't comfort in itself, but after too many meals of the same fat and starch, it felt like a jolt of relief. Pickled eggs became their own saloon trademark. Always visible, always floating in clear or cloudy brine behind the counter. They looked disembodied, unsettling even, but they offered protein on demand. Crack the glass, fish one out, slap it onto the bar. It was fast food, in a century where fast food wasn't even a phrase. A single egg could push away hunger just long enough to keep you upright, and if washed down with whiskey, maybe even distract you from how rubbery the bite truly was. Cowboys accepted them as small miracles. Nobody expected delight, just nutrition that didn't need a fire. Pickled onions matched a different need. Sharp, tangy, aggressive to the tongue. They pierced through the heavy taste of beans or salt pork with enough punch to shock you awake. Some men craved the sharpness. Others grimaced while chewing. Either way, onions cut through monotony with a sting, and that sting made them memorable. Peaches or pears, if ever preserved in vinegar or thick syrup, carried sweetness rare enough to seem foreign. Little jars of faint luxury that traveled long roads to land in drifters' bellies. They didn't show up often, but when they did, they proved sweetness could last a season, even without orchards nearby. Saloons leaned on pickling because it gave them certainty. A cook could open a jar at any hour, spoon out a vegetable or egg, set it down next to a mug, and call it service. Unlike meat, which warned and spoiled and rotted, jars stayed silent on the shelf, stable in ways nothing else achieved. They kept the saloon menu alive during weeks when no wagon brought flour or no rancher sold beef. Vinegar did what smoke and salt alone couldn't. It preserved variety. Emotionally, these sharp, sour sides brought something plain but critical. A reminder that meals didn't always have to taste like grease. The snap of a cucumber, the tang of brine, the sting of vinegar in your nose. It was different. Different mattered more than quality. Different meant you had a reason to sit a little straighter, taste sharper sensations, and tell yourself you weren't entirely trapped by repetition. Even the sourness, powerful enough to twist your face, carried comfort. It reminded you that food could still surprise you. Cowboys didn't look for fine taste. They craved variety in any form. Of course, none of these sides were gourmet. Cheese didn't melt into lovely dishes. It crumbled and fought your teeth. Pickles weren't fresh. They were bitter, acidic, and sometimes unsettling to chew. But survival wasn't about impressing anyone. It was about stretching meals across brutal distances and long months. These jars and bricks made that possible. You could travel half the continent and still find vinegar eggs behind a bar. You could ride until your saddle wore grooves in your hips and still find a sliver of hard cheese hacked off a wheel. They were background characters, but background characters that never left the stage. Think about what that meant. When stew went bad, pork too salty to chew, beans stacked endlessly into monotony, there were still jars behind the bar. Saloons didn't collapse because they knew how to preserve. Hungry men didn't go to bed entirely empty because brine covered what fire couldn't. A sour mouthful, a salty chunk, a sharp bite. These built the scaffolding that kept frontier life upright. Nobody sang praises to vinegar or salted blocks of dairy, but they worked harder at keeping men fed than most cooks could claim. And so cheese and pickled sides became the portable salvation of saloon fare. They left bellies stretched and spirits just steady enough to face tomorrow's exhaustion. They weren't eaten for beauty or joy. They were eaten because they lasted, because they worked, because survival needed allies that didn't vanish after 3 days. This was the truest measure of frontier cuisine. It lived in what made it through the week without turning deadly. A cowboy sitting at a saloon table with a slice of crumbly cheese and a pickled onion wasn't celebrating, but he was surviving, and survival out here was worthy enough. Cheese cracked, vinegar burned, stomachs turned slightly in protest, but energy returned all the same. Measured against hunger, that was victory. And though none of it would ever pass for fine dining, cheese and jars of sour sides stitched meals together across impossible distances, across ruthless weather, across unforgiving work. The night moves on. The pickled egg jar stays behind the counter. The cheese wheel rests in shadow. The vinegar waits patiently for another hand to reach for it. They sit steady, guaranteed. And you, belly fuller than expected, realize that even without flavor, survival can sometimes taste enough like comfort to matter. But no meal in a saloon finished with vinegar or cheese alone. After beans, pork, stew, coffee, eggs, and sour sides, what most men reached for wasn't food at all. What closed the deal, what smoothed the evening and blurred the edges of harsh memory, was whiskey. Why did a shot of whiskey so often pass for supper? Because out here, it did the one thing meals couldn't. It was immediate. No fork, no chewing, no patience required. Just a few coins, a rough swallow, and a hot burn sliding down the throat. Hunger blurred for a while, aches dulled at the edges, courage crept in where weariness had been sitting all day. For cowboys pressed against the limits of energy and coin, whiskey became a kind of dinner in a glass. Call it last course or call it necessity, but in the saloon it held the same place as food. What you got from the bottle wasn't refined spirits stacked neatly on a polished shelf. Whiskey in a Wild West saloon was rough, sometimes improvised. Many batches were distilled in back rooms, barns, or pots never intended for the job. Corn, rye, or whatever grain a barkeep could scrounge went into makeshift stills, coming out raw and fierce. That uneven creation earned it names like rot gut and chain lightning. Nobody paused to taste subtle notes. You threw it back, snapped your eyes shut at the fire tearing its way down, then slapped the glass to the table with a cough. That was the ritual, and that was the experience. Frontier meals weren't meant as dinners in the sense we think of them today. They were rituals, simple plates designed to keep bodies warm, upright, and moving. Beans, pork, stew, coffee, whiskey, all plain, all harsh in their own ways, stood less for taste than for survival. In the Wild West, gritty food was enough. It served its purpose, to give endurance, and to mark the rhythm of days in a world always pressing forward. If you would, sit with them in your mind for a while, and if this quiet walk through the past helped you unwind, consider subscribing softly for more. Slow the cadence. Now close your eyes, remember the warmth of that stew, and rest.